Good evening all and welcome. I've got a pretty big announcement. Come Monday we are doing Woods Week or Nature Week. Monday through Friday I have all new deep woods, middle of nowhere, camping, cabin, and cryptid/skinwalker stories. Yes, indeed. It's gonna be a good week, so be sure to tune in come Monday. But for now, the road is waiting for us, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was just a kid when this happened. My mother was driving late at night, my stepfather sitting beside her, and us three kids sprawled out in the backseat half asleep. The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by darkness, with only the glow of the headlights cutting through the thick night. I don't remember much myself. I had drifted off, lulled by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic passing of reflector posts. But what my mother and stepfather witnessed that night would haunt them forever. Somewhere along the empty stretch of highway, just as we crested a slight hill, two figures flickered into view at the edge of the high beams. My mother's breath caught in her throat as she instinctively tensed against the wheel. Two little girls. They weren't solid, they weren't normal. Their forms were perfect silhouettes, only instead of black shadow, they were composed of piercing, almost an unnatural yellow-white light, featureless yet unmistakable in their shape. They stood in the middle of the road holding hands, their glowing forms stark against the night. They weren't just an instant flicker or a trick of the light. My mother and stepfather saw them long enough for the mind to process what was happening and for terror to bloom in them. My stepfather reacted first, his voice calm but firm. "Don't swerve, just slow down, keep it steady." My mum obeyed, her fingers tight on the wheel as she eased her foot onto the brake. The last thing she wanted was to lose control. The figures didn't move like normal children. There was something wrong about it. They didn't run, they didn't stumble. They just glided, smooth, soundless, and weightless, straight across the road, their hands still clasped together, as though they were leading each other somewhere. And then, just as silently as they had appeared, they reached the other side and simply vanished. Not like a shadow swallowed by darkness, not like an animal darting out of sight. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. The car slowed, but my mother didn't stop. Neither she nor my stepfather spoke for several seconds. The air inside the car was heavy, thick with something unnatural. My mother finally exhaled a shaky breath. "Did you see that?" My stepfather nodded, eyes locked on the road. That was all they said. They didn't wake us, they didn't turn the car around. They just kept driving, the silence lingering long after the figures vanished. It wasn't until we arrived at my grandparents' house that my mother finally told them what they had seen, and the color drained from my grandma's face. "There was an accident there, years ago, on that same stretch of road. Two little girls were hit by a car and didn't make it." Neither of my parents ever doubted what they saw that night, and now, neither do I. I used to travel for work doing construction, constantly on the road from one job site to the next. One particular drive still haunts me. My boss was behind the wheel and I sat in the passenger seat. Both of us were exhausted but eager to get home. We were making our way back from Tennessee to Illinois, just leaving the mountains. The road stretched endlessly ahead, cutting through the dense, silent wilderness. It was late, one of those quiet, eerie nights where the darkness felt heavier than usual. As we crested a hill, something strange caught our attention. A couple of dead deer lay in the middle of the road. At first glance, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Roadkill was common enough, especially this deep in nowhere. But these deer weren't just hit. They were obliterated. It looked like their bodies had been detonated from the inside out, jagged ribs jutting out like broken glass, their flesh torn and scattered in ways that didn't make sense. My boss mumbled, "Damn, must have been a semi hauling ass. Clipped a herd." We kept driving, shaking it off. But as we got to the top of the next hill, there were more. Not just a dozen, maybe hundreds. The highway was littered with their shredded remains. The sheer number of them was staggering, stretching for at least half a mile, maybe more. Some were in pieces, others barely recognizable as deer anymore. The scene was nightmarish, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, torsos split wide open, entrails streaming into the cold night air. The stench of blood and something worse, acrid and metallic, seeped in through the veins. But the most unsettling part, there were no signs of impact, no skid marks, no tire tracks leading off the road. These deer didn't look like they had been hit by trucks. They looked like they had exploded where they stood, as if something inside them had violently torn them apart. My boss, who had been driving for longer than I had been alive, went quiet. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and I turned to him, my voice uneasy. What the hell was that?" He shook his head, eyes locked on the road. "I've no idea. I'm not stopping to find out." His tone was final, flat. We kept moving, the tires crunching over the small pieces of what used to be whole animals. The work truck and trailer were heavy enough that we barely felt the bumps. But knowing what we were driving over made me feel sick to the stomach. The further we went, the worse it got, until finally, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The road ahead was clean, as if nothing had happened. I'd tried to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the less it added up. Maybe a convoy of semis going way too fast had plowed through a massive herd. Maybe some kind of freak explosion had gone off on the highway. Maybe. Or maybe something else entirely. To this day, I don't know what we saw. And honestly, I don't think I want to. Truckers swap stories all the time. Long nights on endless highways, strange things you've glimpsed in the dark, roads that don't feel quite right. But there was one night I'll never forget. It was monsoon season and I was driving through a desolate stretch of badlands in southern Utah. The landscape out there is alien. Twisted rock formations, cracked earth, not a single plant in sight. Just rock and sand stretching for miles. The storm hit hard. Rain poured so heavily that I could barely see 20 feet ahead of me, forcing me slow, basically a crawl. Thunder rocked the truck, the sky flashing with jagged bolts of lightning. Sometimes the rain turned to hail, pounding against the cab in deafening waves. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small, like the earth itself was trying to shake you off. Then as I rounded a bend, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Fire. A wall of flames 20 feet high stretched across the landscape. The ground itself was burning, just rocks and dirt consumed by fire. Despite the torrential downpour, it spread for hundreds of yards in every direction, glowing bright against the storm-darkened sky. I slowed the rig, heart hammering, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was nothing to burn out there, no trees, no grass, just barren land. Now somehow, a light in the rain. It didn't make sense. For a second I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe the long hours on the road were getting to me. But I could feel the heat through the windshield, see the way the flames twisted in the wind. This was real. I kept moving, creeping past the inferno, half expecting something impossible to emerge from the fire. But there was nothing, just rain and flames warring against each other in the empty desert. It wasn't until later I found out what had happened. A propane tank had been taking the highway too fast in the storm. It lost control, skidded off the road, and ruptured violently. The gas ignited instantly, turning the Badlands into an otherworldly blaze. I never saw the truck. It must have been hidden behind a rock formation or swallowed by the fire, and I never found out what happened to the driver. I tell myself there was nothing I could have done, that it was already too late, that stopping wouldn't have made a difference. But sometimes when the rain falls heavy and the road stretches on into the night, I still see it in my mind, fire burning when it shouldn't be. And I wonder if out there in the storm, someone was watching me pass by. I'm part of a Baja off-road racing team, and as part of the crew I get to test drive some seriously powerful off-road machines and trucks. I basically consider myself a truck driver. Well, one night, a buddy and I were driving south along the Gulf of California, making our way down a brutal 5-hour dirt road to Punta Peñasco. If you've never been, let me tell you, it's in the middle of freaking nowhere, just endless desert stretching out in all directions. No streetlights, no towns, no backup if something goes wrong. As we pushed through the darkness, the only sounds were the growl of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. Then out of nowhere, I saw headlights in the rearview mirror. They were closing in and fast. At first I figured it was just some local, or maybe an out-of-towner from the US, getting wasted in the nearest festival town and decided to test their rig out here. Happens all the time. But as the vehicle got closer, something felt off. The thing had bar-mounted headlights on top, or at least that's what it looked like, and those suckers were blinding. I tried waving the driver off, motioning for him to dim his lights, but he didn't budge. He was right on our tail, practically glued to us, pushing us faster and faster down a dangerous road, where one wrong move meant flipping into a ditch, or worse, straight into the ocean. Finally, near a curve by the beach, I spotted a spot where I could bail off without rolling. I cranked the wheel and skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dust. We watched as the lights barreled past us at breakneck speed, heading straight for the curve. That idiot's gonna crash straight into the ocean. But the lights didn't drop. They didn't skid, they didn't even slow. Instead, they kept moving straight off the cliffside and over the water. For a second, I thought that perhaps the vehicle had hit some kind of invisible ramp. But then just as suddenly, the lights pitched upwards, shooting into the night sky. And then they were gone. My buddy and I sat in stunned silence, the only sound our own breath and the distant lapping of waves. "Did you see it?" he finally said. I swallowed hard, still staring at the empty space where the lights had disappeared. We never talked about it again. Not on the rest of the drive, not when we got to Punta Peñasco, not with the rest of the team. Because honestly, who the hell would believe us? One of the creepiest things that had ever happened to me was during a long haul through a remote mountain pass. The main highway had been washed out by a flash flood and was under construction, so I had to take an unfamiliar detour through some isolated terrain. It was getting late and exhaustion was setting in, so I pulled off onto the shoulder and went to sleep in the bunk. This was deep in the middle of nowhere. The closest town was at least 40 miles away, so once the lights were off, it was completely pitch black outside. Around 3:30 a.m., something woke me up. I could hear movement outside, something messing with the air and power cables between the cab and the trailer, just inches from my head on the other side of the wall. Then I felt the whole truck shake as something climbed onto the landing at the back. Whatever it was had to be at least 200 to 300 pounds. My first thought was a bear or mountain lion. Now fully awake, I decided to scare off whatever was out there, so I slammed my hand hard against the cab wall to make a loud noise. The response was instant, a blood-curdling scream, followed by the sound of someone falling off the back of the truck. A second later, multiple voices started yelling all around. I scrambled to the front, turned on the lights, and suddenly illuminated a group of soldiers in full gear. Turns out they were part of a military reserve unit conducting a midnight training exercise. Their mission was to locate and secure an abandoned truck as part of their drill. The actual target was a different truck 3 miles down the road. They hadn't expected to find someone sleeping there and had mistaken my rig for their objective. After a quick explanation, we all had a good laugh about the mix-up. They radioed their commander to clarify the situation and make sure the other squads didn't come after me too. I've been on the road every day and night for work, and on one particular night, I was in a rural part of Arkansas, somewhere between Riverton and Oakdale. The entire 250-mile drive home was along a 2-lane highway. As I was leaving Riverton, the weather had started to turn bad. I called my wife and let her know there were high winds advisories and a strong chance of tornadoes across the region. I told her I'd check in as soon as I reached a safe area. I had already worked a 13-hour shift before getting in my truck, so I grabbed dinner and some coffee to stay awake. Now, if you've never driven through flat farmland at night for over 100 miles, let me tell you it's exhausting. The monotony wears on you, and even without bad weather, it has an eerie, almost surreal quality. About 40 miles into the drive, hail started bouncing off my truck. Being from Arkansas, I knew that hail in July almost always meant tornadoes. I pulled off to the side of the road. There were no streetlights, no headlights ahead of me or behind me, just complete darkness. I rolled down my passenger window and shined my flashlight into the night, scanning for any sign of a tornado, but I saw nothing. Then I turned to the driver's side. There, pressed up against my window, was a face, a man grinning from ear to ear. He was tall, extremely pale, with sunken eyes, but the grin, that's what haunts me. It stretched corner to corner, full of crooked teeth like something out of a nightmare. I screamed, and in an instant he was gone. Heart racing, I slammed the truck into drive and tore out of there. Our work vehicles were always recording with front and rear cameras, so when I finally reached a safe place to stop, I called my wife. I didn't mention the man, I didn't want to scare her, but after we hung up, I pulled the memory card to check the footage. Nothing. He never appeared on the front or rear cameras. To this day, I told myself it must have been my imagination, maybe exhaustion playing tricks on me. But I don't drive through that stretch of highway at night anymore, unless I absolutely have to. I know some think I was probably just overtired, but our vehicles aren't semi-trucks. They're passenger vehicles, outfitted with cameras and GPS for insurance purposes. We aren't under DOT regulations, and if I ever felt too tired, I'd pull over and get a hotel. I wouldn't risk my life or anyone else's just to get home. The road from Huiquilpan to Morelia was a winding ribbon of darkness twisting through the night under a starless, moonless night. It was the kind of drive where shadows stretched long, where headlights barely cut through the void, and where every curve felt like it belonged to another world. Our father, who we affectionately called Doc, and I used to talk about everything on these late-night drives, dreams, plans, stupid jokes that made us laugh until our sides hurt, and I always sat in the middle of the back seat, my usual spot. It was the best place to listen without missing a word. Our mom often dozed off quickly, and sometimes Ivan, my younger brother, did too. But that night, none of us were ready for what was coming. Out of nowhere, blinding headlights exploded in the mirror, flooding the car with harsh white light. A deep guttural roar followed. An engine pushed hard, clawing through the night. Before we had time to react, the vehicle tore up to our bumper, its presence a sudden, violent force. Then, with reckless precision, it swerved, overtaking us on a blind curve. A Ford Maverick, or maybe a Mustang. It cut in front of us so sharply that Doc had no choice but to yank the wheel. The tires screamed in protest, my body lurched. And then just as suddenly the chase began. This wasn't just some reckless driver. They weren't just passing us, they wanted us to stop. A flood of questions raced through my mind, but fear gave no space for answers. The vehicle sped up again, pulling alongside us, close enough that I could make out 4 silhouettes inside. They swerved aggressively, their movements deliberate as if trying to force us off the road. The highway stretched ahead, long, empty, and desolate. The next town was a distant glow on the horizon, and still too far away. Doc's grip on the wheel tightened, his knuckles bone white, and his voice was low and controlled. "Hold on." The engine beneath us roared as he floored the accelerator, matching their speed. The Maverick tried to pass again, but Doc cut them off, veering just enough to block them without losing control. The driver backed off for a second, but only to regroup. The headlights flickered in erratic bursts, flashing wildly, almost mocking. That's when I saw them. Their faces. Grins twisted into something cruel, eyes locked onto us like predators sizing up their prey. Then they lunged again, edging closer. So close I swore they were going to ram us. Time stretched, unbearably thin. My breath caught in my throat, and then, just before impact, Doc fainted, jerking the wheel towards them in a last-second bluff, and it worked. The driver panicked. The Maverick wavered, falling back just enough, and our car surged forward, humming beneath us like a desperate animal eating the distance between us and safety. And then, up ahead, hope. The lights of the town flickered brighter, civilization pulling us into its grasp. The Maverick hesitated. They must have realized their time was up. One last attempt, a final lunge, but too late. We were nearly there. And just as suddenly as they had appeared, they let up. Their headlights dimmed, their speed dropped, and the car that had hunted us simply disappeared into the darkness again. Inside our car, the silence was deafening. Mum was crying, Ivan was crying, and I was crying too, terrified but alive. Doc kept driving, his hands still locked on the steering wheel, the ghost of the tension lingering in his knuckles. We had escaped by luck, or maybe by Doc's sharp reflexes, but we never forgot that night. I live in Kansas, and have driven that long, desolate stretch of road westward to Colorado more times than I can count. It's a vast emptiness, just miles and miles of nothing. The few tiny towns you do pass are little more than crumbling buildings and forgotten relics of another time. Even in the daylight, the loneliness out there feels heavy. I've never had to drive it at night, but I know I'd get spooked real quick. And for some reason this state seems to have too many people who get their kicks messing with lone drivers late at night. I don't know if they're bored, deranged, or just trying to scare the hell out of people, but I've had at least 3 experiences that make my skin crawl. It always starts the same way. Some random car appears out of nowhere, passes me, then slows way down until I have no choice but to pass them, and then like clockwork, they speed up, linger beside me too long, and repeat. It's like they're playing some twisted game. One time it went on for nearly half an hour. No traffic, no exits, just me and this lunatic in the middle of nowhere. It got worse when we finally reached a toll plaza. There were multiple open lanes, plenty of space to go through, but instead of following them, they followed me into mine. I had a K tag, so the worker just waved me through, but I stopped. Something in my gut told me to speak up. I told her the vehicle behind me had been tailing me for miles, playing this bizarre game, and now they had followed me into my lane despite the other lanes being completely empty. Her expression changed immediately. "They don't have a K tag," she said. "I'll take my time getting their payment so you can get ahead." But before she even had the chance, the car behind me suddenly backed up and switched into another lane. That's when I knew for sure. Whoever was in that car wasn't just messing around. They were watching me. The toll worker wasn't having it. She turned on the red X for my lane, blocking any other cars from coming behind me, and radioed the other workers in the next booth. I heard her tell them to stall the driver, they've been following this person, and that they were being really sketchy. The other car just sat there. For the whole 2 minutes they didn't move, didn't inch forward, just idled, as if they were waiting to see what I did next. The toll worker kept watching them, and eventually the other worker must have forced them to go through. They pulled off slowly and crept down the highway at a crawl. I wasn't taking any chances. I sat at the toll booth for another 5 minutes waiting for them to get far away. And the second I took off, I exited at the very first opportunity instead of taking the highway. I cut through town, weaved my way to a back road that led me home, terrified that they had pulled over somewhere up ahead, waiting for me. It was 2 a.m, no traffic, no witnesses. If I hadn't have stopped to talk to that toll worker, I don't know what would have happened. I hate people who do that kind of stuff. It's not just annoying, but deeply unsettling. And out there in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the empty highway stretching ahead, you start to realize just how easy it would be for someone to make a driver disappear. And that alone is enough to make anyone's blood run cold. I worked in the truck stop industry for about 15 years. All of the following stories took place at the same location, where I worked for less than 18 months. I was given the opportunity to help open this brand new location, and since it came with a fat raise and a promotion, I definitely accepted. It has now been about 5 years since the location opened, and I don't believe there is a single employee left that was there when we opened, of the over 60 employees we hired prior to opening day. On opening day, not long after the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a woman delivering flowers dropped the flowers on her sandaled foot and sliced her foot open, bleeding all over the entrance. Within a week of being opened, we had water and sewage coming up through all the drains, including sewage ones outside and all over the property. It had not been raining. It wasn't like a flood situation weather-wise. We had no idea what caused it to suddenly happen. And just as quickly as it had happened, it went away. The plumbers were baffled. A couple of months after we opened, we faced a severe storm that destroyed the high-rise interstate sign and caused a 7-hour power outage. I had sent several people home, but I had kept a few employees in case the power returned. As we sat in the restaurant dining room chatting under electric candlelight, an employee who was a local resident and had lived in the town all of her life mentioned that the people were a little worried when this place was announced to be built on this property, as it had been rumored to be a Native American burial ground for years. I have zero way to prove or disprove if this is accurate, but given the events and things getting more serious as time went on, it definitely made us wonder. When the power did come back, despite several steps I took to unplugging all the equipment to make sure the surge wouldn't fry stuff, we lost several pieces of expensive equipment. Some of this equipment was critical and caused major operational problems for weeks until it could be replaced. The first winter after we opened was the coldest in years. So cold that we had to buy space heaters for the servers in the electrical room so the servers wouldn't freeze. We had issues with frozen pipes, especially in the truck care center and the restaurant. 6 months after opening was the first death. A truck driver came in to take a shower in one of the shower rooms, and we had sensors on the doors that let us know how long someone had been in there. If the timer had been going for a few hours, we would knock on the door to see if maybe they had actually left so that we could clean it for the next driver. The employee knocked on the door of a shower that had been in use for a few hours, and there wasn't an answer. She used the key to open the door, and the driver was on the floor. He had died of a stroke, He had been driving a semi-truck 30 minutes before he entered that room. The employee who had opened the door was significantly traumatized. The company did a great job of offering support for her, but she didn't last much longer after that. A few weeks later was one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. Let's see what you make of it. I was working on the restaurant side of the truck stop as the restaurant manager had quit after a series of bad things happened to her, and they asked me to move into the role temporarily. The assistant manager on the store side came over because the freakiest thing had just happened. She pulls me into the side store office and pulls up the cameras to show me what has happened. The small 4-door sedan pulls into the lot, but doesn't go into the gas station side. They pull up into the truck stop side, where the semi-trucks pull in. He parks next to the maintenance shed, which is located adjacent to the main building and very close to a large trash compactor. He gets out of the vehicle, opens one of the doors and pulls out a trash bag. He throws the trash bag on top of the compactor and then gets in his car and leaves the property. I don't remember exactly how long, as she had to fast forward the footage, but I think it was about an hour or two when he returned. He pulls back next to the compactor, climbs atop of it, and chucks the bag onto the roof of the maintenance shed. He then climbs down off the compactor, gets in his car, and leaves, never to return. When this was noticed by an employee who had been outside gathering trash to take to the compactor, the maintenance shed is more of a small building/garage. It's about 20 by 20. If the employee had not seen him throw it up there, it probably wouldn't have been noticed. Once the employee saw the individual leave, he went into the shed, got a ladder, and went to get the bag on top of the roof. He brought the bag inside to show the assistant manager. Inside the bag were a ton of papers. These documents listed hundreds of thousands of addresses located across the US. Under each address was a specific hidden location on each property where a body could be found. No information on who the individuals were, just gender and location of the individual. The location spanned from coast to coast, but I didn't get a chance to look into them too deeply. I was really freaked out and thought that touching them maybe would contaminate the evidence. So we just put what we had pulled out back in the bag. The obvious answer here was to call the police, and that's what we did next. Now the thing about truck stops is that they are more often than not in remote locations along interstates for obvious reasons. The town this truck stop is located in has 3 police officers total. It's a town with less than 1,000 people. So when I say the chief of police showed up, it's because he was the highest ranking officer of 3 in town. And he hated us. Because you see, truck stops bring crime, and suddenly he had a lot more work to do. He comes in, watches the footage and looks in the bag, and the most frustrating thing here is that he isn't concerned in the slightest. He asked what we wanted him to do about it. It was probably a prank. He took the items with him, filed out a form request for the footage and left. I sincerely hope he at least forwarded them to the FBI. A couple of weeks after this, there was a body found of a bound, nude, and recently deceased man across the street at a dump. Because it was a dump, they had no idea where the individual had originated from. Sometime in the following weeks, there was the second death on the property. It was a driver that had died within his truck. Somewhere in the middle of this, we had another severe storm, and the interstate high-rise was destroyed again. We had another weird incident involving abandoned things, but this one had a resolution. A driver came in to show us that someone had left. Ratchet straps and small children's clothes folded up neatly next to a diesel pump. The combination of the items was alarming to me, so I got on the camera system and called the police. I was able to find the truck that left these, and luckily I got one of the amazing police officers in the town this time. She actually did a job, followed up with me to let her know what she had found, and located the driver and called him. He had his kid in the truck for a while for summer break, but it had ended, so he had brought her home with her mum and wasn't going to see the kid for a while, so he was cleaning out his truck. He had this clothing and some straps that he didn't need and thought someone else could use the items. He didn't think about the combination of the two, raising eyebrows, and honestly was really grateful that someone would be worried and follow the case up. A few months after the first year mark, the state DOT had to shut down the off and on ramp because the interstate exit was starting to collapse, and they were worried that the overpass would collapse as well. We had nearly zero business for weeks as construction crews rebuilt the ramps and replaced the overpass. It was during this time that I earned a promotion to a general manager role and was moved to a different location. I kept in touch for a while, especially with my former boss and the assistant manager. The incidents continued. A few months after I left, there were two major incidents, but I cannot remember which one came first. One was involving an individual that entered the building with a machete. He was aggressive, the employees were terrified. I wish I hadn't have deleted it, but there is footage of the state troopers coming in with AKs and drop-kicking the guy. Unsure where this person came from as he walked, and the location is 10 to 15 miles from the nearest town. The second was a customer who attacked a teenage cashier because he didn't get the customer's lotto ticket correct and got into a brawl with the maintenance guy who came to the kid's defense. Slowly over time I lost touch with them, and they both left the location, so I stopped getting the stories. I don't know if they're continuing. Haunted? A portal to hell? I don't know. But what I do know is I now avoid truck stops like the plague. It was a scorching day in South Florida, the kind where the heat shimmers off the pavement like a mirage, and the air was thick with humidity. My friend and I were driving down the desolate stretch of road known as Alligator Alley, a place where the Everglades press in on both sides, endless sawgrass and cypress trees stretching into the horizon. It was the kind of place where you could disappear, and no one would ever find you. We had been driving for miles with nothing but the occasional truck passing by, when I spotted something large up ahead. A suitcase, just sitting on the side of the road. It was old, dark-colored, and scuffed up like it had been through hell. I laughed and nudged my friend. "Hey, free suitcase. Should we grab it?" They snorted. "Yeah, 'cause nothing bad ever comes from picking up random luggage in the middle of nowhere." We kept driving, but something about it lingered in the back of my mind. There was something off about it. And later that evening, we found out why. That suitcase wasn't just some lost luggage. It was all over the local news. It had been part of a mafia hit. A body had been stuffed inside and left out in the open. Not buried, not hidden, just placed and waiting to be found. The realization made my skin crawl. We had just casually driven past a murder scene, cracking jokes, oblivious to the grim reality, sitting a few feet from the truck. I still think about it sometimes. Now I have another story for you. I grew up in a small town where nothing much happened, at least nothing normal. One afternoon I was sitting at a stop sign lost in my own thoughts, when I felt it. That strange prickling sensation creeping up the back of my neck, like someone was staring at me. The kind of feeling you don't question, you just know. I turned my head instinctively, following that invisible thread of unease, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing just off the road, half concealed by the brush, was something huge. At first, my brain struggled to process it. It looked like a wolf, but no wolf should have been that big. The thing was easily the size of a pony, its thick grey fur rippling with each of its slow breaths, and its eyes were an unnatural piercing gold, which were locked onto mine with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. For a long moment we just looked at each other. Then with eerie slowness it turned and walked away, vanishing in the undergrowth like it hadn't been there at all. A few weeks later, a police officer I knew mentioned something strange. "Hey, you ever heard about anything big running around outside of town, smashing through fences and killing livestock and then vanishing?" My stomach dropped. I didn't say much, I just shrugged it off. But deep down, I knew, because I had seen something. But I just don't think he would have believed me. I've seen some truly disturbing things over the years. Maybe it was just fatigue, or maybe it wasn't. But I've witnessed massive man-like shadows dart across the road way too fast for their size. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot, never got a clear view. It was always just beyond the reach of my headlights, where I couldn't be entirely sure if I saw anything at all. But it definitely looked like something large, crossing an entire road in a few steps. Another time I was driving alone, along a desolate stretch of Highway 14, heading west. That area is long and empty, with only a few small towns scattered here and there. As the night wore on, I started noticing an old, beat-up motorhome passing me again and again. Each time, several people inside were staring at me, their faces nearly pressed into the glass, watching me with unsettling interest. And every time they passed, I never saw where I had overtaken them again. A couple of times I swear they passed me twice, in areas where there were no rest stops or exits. There was nowhere they could have pulled over unseen. And yet there they were, passing me again. Those same eerie faces. Each one looking like some variation of Charles Manson or some other kind of freak. By the time I reached a truck stop in Baxter, I was more than a little uneasy. And then there was that rest area on Route 9 near the town of Fairview. I had just used the facilities and was getting ready to leave. As I was about to pull out, I caught sight of a guy opening his car door. The angle was just right for me to see that he was completely naked. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he stepped out, casually started walking around his car fully exposed. I don't know if he was high or something, or if he just thought, "This is a good way to pick up a truck driver I've never met before." Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I just drove off and never looked back. I deliver and transport dog, cats, and pets for a living. So I do have some stories about things I've seen on the road. The least scary part is usually the road itself. It's really other people you have to watch out for. Now, a lot of my job involves me being out in rural areas. I'm not talking about some town or house 30 minutes away from the closest Walmart, although there are plenty of those. I'm talking about places where the closest gas station is an hour away, if not further. Walmart? You better make a whole day trip just to get to one. I laugh when people say they live in the middle of nowhere because they're 40 minutes from the nearest Cracker Barrel. Needless to say, this loneliness tends to make people act a little weird. So, I have to say that the scariest thing I have encountered have been both in Nevada. Nevada is probably the strangest state in the lower 48. You have Las Vegas already in the southernmost tip, and then you have Reno near the northwestern corner of it. Then everywhere else there are numerous tiny towns, barely more than a few ranches and gas stations most of the time. Some folks will try and claim that Las Vegas and Reno aren't the real Nevada, but Nevada isn't complete without them. Vegas, probably more than any other city, has the absolute highest of highs and lowest of lows. But this story takes place in the biggest little city in the world, Reno. It was about 7 in the morning, and I had just finished getting ready in the bathroom of a very sketchy motel 2 miles from what could be considered the main part of Reno. I was about to head out when I heard banging and yelling coming from outside my hotel room, and I then heard glass shattering. I peeked through the window to see the US Marshals dragging a shirtless guy out from a hotel room before cuffing him and leaving him in a prone position on the asphalt. I waited in my room for an hour before coming out and getting in my car to leave. My second story takes place about 30 minutes to an hour north of Winnemucca. I was driving out west with someone else, Jose, who had never been out west, let alone in the arse end of nowhere out west. It was 3 in the morning and he woke me up to tell me that he could not find the gas station that he put in, and that he couldn't see any signs of one. Now, once you get away from I-80 and I-15, it gets dark out there. He also had lost GPS signal, so I asked him how long he had been driving and looking. He told me about 40 miles and it was realistically more like 20. At this point I was more than a little pissed because we were nearly out of gas, and it was apparent that this guy was planning on running it to empty before stopping like an idiot, rather than just stopping at the only place with an actual 24-hour gas station for at least 150 miles going either north or south. So with no other choice I told him to go back to Winnemucca. Soon signal picked up again, and I found out that there was a marathon that opened at 4 in the morning just a few miles away, and I told Jose to go there, and we began driving, until we ran out of gas a mile away. So in this case we started pushing the car to the gas station, and suddenly Jose yelled at me and asked if I said something. I told him I hadn't, and then I heard a guy yelling from behind Jose, probably 100 feet. I had this huge mag light in the truck and pointed it in the direction of the voice. It illuminated a short white dude who was like, "You guys need help pushing?" I said we did, and we finished pushing it to the gas station where we filled up. I spoke to the man a bit, and he told Jose and I a story about how he and a friend were looking for this chick that she knew who went missing, and how she had ditched him at the rest area because he pissed her off. And then he asked us to stop at one of the 4 houses in this town that the gas station was in, and Jose and I almost gunned it out of there thinking the dude was about to commit home invasion in this tiny-ass house in the middle of goddamn nowhere. But we came up with a box of change to help him get back to Portland. He asked where we were going and what we did, and I told him that we were working on repairing farming and construction equipment remotely, and he seemed to take that story. I then told him that we were heading to Bend before heading back to East Montana, and then began the most awkward 6 to 7 hour drive of my life. If you haven't driven to Bend, Oregon, from the east, it's an awful drive. The towns in between I-80 and Nevada and Bend are really sad. You reach those towns that have a population of 72, and there's just a collection of wooden shacks. They might have a gas station with a pump that's 50 years old, but they usually don't, and it's rare to see people under the age of 50 in those places too. People like to mention dying towns, but those towns probably died stillborn, and we just came across whatever was left of them. We eventually reached Bend and parted ways with this weird traveler. I don't think he would have done anything to us, but it was definitely uncomfortable. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's collection of stories. Please join me on Monday, because it's gonna be good. You're gonna love the stories I have prepared for you. I'm excited just to read them, and I know you guys are gonna love listening, so be sure to see me there. That's it from me. Huge thanks as always to my members and patrons whose name can be seen on screen. Thank you all you guys for signing up. It really means the world. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.